G'day, hi, and welcome. Alright, let's get into this WW3 update. So, I was listening to Assad talk about, I didn't get to see the whole 40-minute interview, but he was talking a few things about, the U.S. Not cooperating with them and stuff like that. And said uh, there's no dialogue between the West and him. And he also came out and said, like, he's not going to be pressured by the West to step down. He says, if the people want me to go, I'll go. But I'm not going to go because the West wants me to go. That type of thing. But he says he says they're blaming, Assad for ISIS and stuff like that. He says, which is ridiculous. He says, he basically, confirms that yes, ISIS is made up of all these jihadi groups that the U.S. has basically funded. Not just the U.S. It's there's quite a few people in on this, such as Israelis and etc. etc. And the thing is that what he is saying is that okay, well, the Russians, they invited the Russians in. Assad's always been more than welcoming to the Russians, to come in and help fight ISIS. But he says the only way we're going to beat ISIS is if we work together. So that question keeps coming up that people won't talk about on the mainstream media is it more important that Obama, uh, you know, uh, basically doesn't, comply, to help Assad to overthrow ISIS than it is to have the refugees. So in other words, they care more about overthrowing Assad than they do, defeating ISIS. And it's pretty, it's pretty obvious at this point. But what nobody's asking is why. Well, again, it comes back to the Israeli lobby, the neocon, you know, faction in the states, and it's not just in the states. Pretty much every government in the Western world is, pretty much controlled by Zionists. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, you're just anti-Semite, whatever." Yeah, but you got to look at it for what it is. Look at the policy. The policy tells you a lot. You have a lot of Zionists out there in Europe and in Canada and the United States talking about everybody opening their borders for the refugees, but yet nobody's talking about Israel opening its borders for the refugees. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of funny how they do that, right? A little bit of a double standard there. But there's also another take on it here that you have to keep in mind is that other countries are starting to, back out of the United States is isolating itself big time through U.S. foreign policy. And I agree with Paul Craig Roberts on this one, that U.S. foreign policy is to generate as much hatred for the United States, and I can imagine Israel as well, as possible, so that they always have an enemy to fight, right? So, war's a racket and everything like that. But there's multi agendas here too, so we have to look at that as well. But one of the things about U.S. foreign policy is that people are looking at it and saying, okay, we have Assad. Is he a nice guy? No, we know he's not a nice guy. But we also know ISIS is a hell of a lot worse. So we're seeing the Russians go in, and they're getting ready to, they're putting tanks in there. Not a lot of stuff, but they are putting stuff in there to fight the Islamic State. And there's already rumors out there that they already are. Now the Russians have been in there since the beginning. Again, I remember seeing video footage of a T-90, two T-90s going through Syria with Russians in them. And we also know about the what was it, 84,000 Ukrainian and Russian mercenaries that were going to go and help Assad. Remember, there was already a lot of Russians in Syria anyway, because around the base of Tartus and stuff like that. So basically, right now, what the United States is telling everybody is that anybody in Libya that's a U.S. citizen, it's best to leave now. So they're saying that for a reason, right? So they're telling people to get the hell out of Dodge just because some massive conflict is coming down the pike. Now, there's another problem. It looks like a few countries are not, they're kind of questioning the U.S. foreign policy, and they're saying, "Hey, we don't know if we want to go along with this anymore." And we'll have to see where it leads to and how it plays out. But it looks like a really big player in there. Well, we'll start with Australia. Australia apparently just had some regime change there. Apparently, they go through a lot of prime ministers. I'm not always 100% up on the Australian politics. I get an idea of, I mean, their system is fairly similar to here in Canada, but a little bit different processes there as well. And they just got a new guy, and the new guy apparently not much better than the old guy, but at least he's more willing to deal with the Russians. Now, it also comes at a time when France and Germany, and I think a few other countries, are starting to question the sanctions against Russia, because they're looking at the United States, who's still doing business with Russia, meanwhile telling everybody else, do sanctions against Russia. It's the most bizarre thing, right? And we're also looking at the migrant crisis, which is very, very prominent now. Now, somebody has come out and said that the whole thing about this crisis, why it popped up so fast, I mean, it's been going on for a long time, but why it's popped up so fast is because, as of the making of this video, the Eurozone had pretty much has just collapsed. Now, whether that's true or not, it's hard to say. Again, most people wake up in the morning and go do their job, but if we look at the stock market crashes in the past 2, 3, 4 weeks, month, whatever, worldwide, I mean, the whole global economy is coming down. It's basically China, everything's coming down. Like China's having problems. Difference is the Chinese, okay, well, they've got a bit of an upper hand because, yeah, they're just as corrupt or whatever, sure, there's no question about that, but they have leased back their currency by gold, and they don't have anywhere near the debt that the United States has. The United States has a phenomenal amount of debt. It's not just the $18 trillion on the books, it's the unfunded liabilities, which could be up to another 240 trillion. Some people even say might be even higher. That much money doesn't exist on 10 planets, let alone one, right? So we can see that there's a recipe for disaster here. So with the Russians going into Syria at this time, again, why are they intervening now? Why didn't they intervene right in the beginning? So we're looking at it is that there's probably, again, what the Russians are doing is boxing the United States in a corner. Remember a couple of years ago, John Kerry came out there, and he's out there saying that well, we have to attack Syria because Assad's got chemical weapons, and he it's not like he's going to give up his chemical weapons, so unless he does that, we have to attack, right? Well, what does Russia do? Putin gets on the phone with Assad and says, hey, yeah, give up your weapons. And now he hears, and you've been hearing it on the mainstream, same here in Canada, it's the same narrative, is that, oh, Assad's been using barrel bombs against his people. Okay, yeah, barrel bombs versus 500 and 750 pound and 1,000 and 2,000 pound JDAMs or free fall bombs. Yeah, and they're worried about barrel bombs. It's the stupidest argument ever. I'm pretty sure these barrel bombs are nowhere near as effective, and if they are using this, probably because they're running out of bombs. That said, the thing that's to keep in mind here is that now we're going to have Russian jets, we do have Russian jets, we do have Russian tanks, and who knows how many personnel are going to be on the ground there, that may actually get into conflict, with direct conflict with the United States. This is not like the Ukraine, where the Ukraine is completely covert for the Russians and semi-covert for the United States. Here it's direct and direct, so meaning you have direct Russian Federation airplanes that will be flying within the vicinity of Israeli and US airplanes. Meaning the likelihood of a dogfight accidentally ensuing could be, it's a possibility. And I don't think that this is an accident at all. This is definitely done by design. It is the Russians really pushing back here. And I have a feeling we're probably going to see a few Israeli airplanes get shot down by Russians. That's what I'm thinking. And of course, this is going to create an international incident. Now, US probably will not go directly against the Russians. They need to be the savior. They can't be the instigator. And the whole goal to go to war here, Joe Skousen, Steve Bushenik, Paul Craig Roberts, all those guys kind of agree. The idea is to get Russia or China to strike first. So if they could get a Russian Su-27 or something like that, or MiG-29 shooting down an Israeli airplane, well, then it looks like the Russians are attacking Israel, which gives almost not a complete green light to go to war, but the American people have to ask themselves, are they willing to go to war for Israel? Because remember, a war with Russia, no, we're not going to knock these guys out in a month like they did Saddam. These guys, I know a lot of people, oh, the Russian stuff is junk, it's junk, it's junk. It's good enough. Is it amazing? Maybe yes, maybe no. But the Russians aren't hacks. They have a more than competent enough military. Again, arguing whether an F-15 is really better than an Su-27 or an Su-27 is really better than an F-15 is really kind of mute, because both airplanes in the hands of the right pilot, a better pilot's going to win anyway. And I think the losses, if you want to get an idea of what kind of losses, you can go listen to the South Front report in Ukraine, where one day the Ukrainian forces lose a whole bunch of guys and tanks. The next day it's the Donetsk People's Republic loses a whole bunch of people and tanks and whatever. And it's going to be that kind of World War II-ish kind of, high cost. Again, just that extremely high cost. But I think what we're mostly going to see is the Russians are going to kill a lot of Mossad, probably SAS, and American Special Forces on the ground. They're going to kill a lot of these, and I think that's probably why you're seeing Germany and France and a few other countries kind of jump ship on this one, because they're like, well, if we put our boots on the ground and the Russians are there, we're supporting ISIS, we're supporting the Free Syrian Army and ISIS, and if we're doing that, that's who they're going to be bombing. Meaning we're going to get our guys intentionally killed. And the question, and this kind of gives a bit of an upper hand to the Russians, because the Russians are playing in on the dialogue that they're just there to defeat ISIS. The Russians have come out and said, yes, well, it's, the United States has been arming these proxy groups for years, which is true. That's U.S. foreign policy. And it's what leads to these jihadi groups. So ISIS is a U.S. creation. There's no doubt about it. I know a lot of my viewers are American. They don't want to hear that, but I think most of my American viewers know that. They don't. It's like, yeah, you're not telling me anything I don't know. Now they don't. Most people in the States, I'm pretty sure, don't support that. But you have to understand, it's not what the people support. It's what the lobby groups in Washington are forced to, support. Basically, we fund your campaign. You go to war for us. You take out these guys. You take out those guys. You do whatever. And that's what we're seeing, right? That's what we've always been seeing. All wars for Israel, all wars are bankers' wars. These are the two things that go hand in hand. Neocons are Zionists. They're not all Jewish, but they are, some are Christians, some are Jews. Whatever. Zionism is kind of a supremacy movement in itself. And this is what we're seeing. So, you can't really, there's no way to dodge around it. It is what it is. We know about Israel, lighting off some dirty nukes in the desert there. What are they preparing for? That type of thing. And they're also at a time when they're getting ready to use snipers against Palestinians who throw rocks. So we know what the Israeli doctrine is like. I have nothing against the Israeli people, but my whole thing is, why are we there in the first place, right? And I think that's what a lot of people are starting to ask. Why are we there in the first place? Now, this idea of going to war in Iraq and Syria and stuff like that, again, Assad, I think, pretty much sums it up well. He says, we didn't ask them to come here. This is not our, it's not their place. The people, Assad said this. He says the Western propaganda is saying that they're fleeing because of his tyranny. He says no. He says they're fleeing because there's, NATO jets bombing the crap out of them, and they're fleeing ISIS. That's what they're fleeing. The refugees are even agreeing with him. I mean, hey, he got 84% of the vote in his last election, and it's not because he rigged the election. I don't know anybody. I mean, I'm sure there might be some people out there that would like to live under the Islamic State, but I haven't really met too many people that would. I mean, the Syrians were enjoying an actually decent way of life. Maybe not a phenomenal way of life, but an okay way of life before the U.S. decided to arm the Free Syrian Army. And again, Joe Biden, Vice President of the United States, pretty much admitted that. You can't get any more official. The question is, what do we do about it? So Donald Trump's out there, and somebody started asking him, I can't remember exactly how the question went, but something along the lines of, what are we going to do about ISIS and all that stuff? He says, well, we'll deal with that or whatever. He says, and what are we going to do about the Russians? Because right now the U.S. propaganda is that the Russians are just starting to invade in Syria without, and Assad has been begging the Russians to come in for a long time. The Russians, I think, have been staying out because they just don't want to, they know war is not popular. They don't want to send people there. So, but they do have agreements for weapons and stuff like that with Syria. So Trump is saying, how are you going to deal with Putin? He says, well, we're going to negotiate. He says, right now, the United States, we don't get along with anybody. So in other words, he's saying the United States has no friends. Donald Trump is right on this. The sentiment for the U.S. around the world, maybe not so much for the people, but for definitely the U.S. government, is not good. They're not necessarily looked at as the world's savior. This idea that, again, overthrowing Gaddafi, overthrowing Saddam, these guys are not good people, sure. Even Bashar al-Assad is not a great guy. He should be arrested for crimes against humanity. But, what's the bigger crime? A dictator or a country that comes in, invades, destroys the infrastructure, takes out the military, and arms, jihadi groups that flourish throughout the Middle East? You got to think of the economic spin-off on this. The war on terror is even more profitable than probably the war on drugs, right? So more police, more surveillance, less rights, less freedoms, and more war, right? So that has a lot to do with it. So again, we're seeing also the cultural clashes out there in Europe. People, like in Hungary and stuff like that, putting up fences. I don't think anybody's been killed yet per se, but that's coming. I mean, at some point, they're just going to machine gun the borders. They're just going to say no, enough's enough. And the reason why I think this is happening is something that I had talked about. Don't know if I have the video up yet from the making of this video, but in one of my Q&As is that they may be using the migrant crisis to hide to cover the collapse of the euro. Which, if they come out and say, well, the eurozone has just collapsed, yada yada yada, all because of the migrant crisis, well, it was manufactured. Again, we have George Soros money in there. We have a French politician. She was buying rafts for the refugees. So where's this lady getting money for rafts for refugees, right? And you see it in the States. It's the same policy in the States where they sent the DHS agents to go into South America and start picking people up on these buses, just flooding them into the States. So you could see that the agenda is the same where it's the same in all the European countries. It's the same in all, in Canada and the United States, but not Israel. So yes, I am picking on Israel today. So, but we have to, because if we don't call this stuff out, it's never going to change. And I think that's what people are rejecting right now, is that they know what the plan is. It's to destabilize and destroy, and also to erode sovereignty. Now here in Canada, we have probably one of the best immigration systems in the world in a lot of ways, but we're just bringing in way too many people for the size of our country. We bring in more people per capita than any other country in the world. We're bringing in 250,000. Some countries will take in more people, but when you work it out per capita, we're bringing in more. Now, right now it's not a problem because most of our immigrants are economic immigrants, about 61% of them. And they usually get kind of fast-tracked if they have better skills and stuff like that. And that's good. And we know where most of these people come from. They're not just kind of coming in over a border somewhere, so they're coming in through the front door. The problem is not now, but it's 10 years down the road when we start to see 2.5 million people start to sway a vote or start demanding this or that or whatever. Because it'd be different if we were taking in immigrants from all over the place, but we're really only taking in immigrants from basically the Middle East and Asia. That's the only places we're really taking them from, in Africa. So we are going to get a demographic change like they are facing in Europe. Now, why they're doing this, some for voting, there's a whole host of reasons why they're doing this. But to erode national sovereignty is the easiest way to do it, is through mass immigration, because most people come in, they just go along to get along. They're not going to make any demands of restoring anything, right? So, and that's what people in Europe are faced with right now, and they know that's what it's about. Now, these refugees, are they legitimate? Are they not? Yes, I believe most of them are. But there's also, too, a lot of them of fighting age and ISIS age, ISIS fighter age, that type of thing. And you can't count out that there's going to be some there. And as soon as you hear the argument that, oh, well, you're just racist and bigot if you bring up that argument, so, well, then why does Israel have its borders closed to the refugees? You know what I mean? So, so it's like, and then, because, Israel can do no wrong, right? So, yes, I am picking on Israel today because, again, when you see all this stuff playing out, this is why we're doing it, right? This is one of the root causes. And it's openly admitted, and you can figure out that, and you're starting to hear some politicians out there coming out and say, yeah, we got to get away from the Israeli lobby. This is why nobody likes the GOP right now. And as hard, and what tells you Donald Trump is kind of on the right track, I don't think he's going to fix the country. That the United States, it's going to collapse no matter what. Like it's in collapse mode now. There's nothing to stop it. Even if they kick the can down the road again, there is no recovery in the United States. Most people are aware of this. Look, even up here in Canada, we know that the number one issue is the economy. And the reason why it's the number one issue is because there's more people awake than you think. We just don't know what to do about it, right? So with a lot of people, what's going to happen is they're just going to demand more government, more free stuff. But other people, they're going to revolt. They're going to revolt big time. And in the States, again, don't be surprised if there's a military coup there. I don't think we're going to see another Muammar Gaddafi kind of slaughter anytime soon, but I do believe the world elites, that is the future of the world elites. And I'm not making any threats. It's just, the jig's up. People know that they're lying. And at some point, when people have had enough, that human wave that's going to hit them, there's nothing to stop that. And when we're looking at the eurozone and stuff like that, we know that the eurozone, yes, some countries are doing well, but most countries are fed up with the eurozone. And with the Russian sanctions, most people are looking at this, and they're starting to figure it out that, hey, you know what? Yeah, this is propaganda from the U.S. and they don't want to be a part of it. And again, I'm not trying to demonize the U.S. It's just because it's not the people, it's the government, and you have to keep stating that because again, it's if you were an American, I can imagine that you'd be embarrassed about your government. Because most of my commenters that are from the states say, "Hey, nobody, we don't like our government at all, but we're good people," and that's true, and it's the same in most of these countries. Like in the Middle East and stuff like that. The people are fine. It's they have their way of life, and that's the way they do it. Where the problem comes is when you have these George Soros funded groups and Henry Kissinger, and yeah, these guys always show up wherever any tragedy or war going on in the world. These two names always seem to kind of come up all the time. How they support it, what they fund it with, what groups they're funding it with. Because you have to understand, the world is really only run by a handful of people, and this is the problem. This is why the global economy is pretty much dying, because it's strangled by these, basically sovereignty reaping, trade deals that don't really help anybody but a handful of corporations that are all owned by, you guessed it, like Rothschilds or Rockefellers. They're pretty much, at the end of the day, everything is owned by them. So these monopolies, again, they can't be propped up. They're unsustainable. It's not, natural free market enterprise. We don't live in a capitalist society. Nobody does. I've often referred to that the only capitalists in the world right now are basically drug dealers, because they have no middleman or regulation or oversight, right? So, not that I'm condoning it, but you get the idea. That's about the closest you're going to get to capitalism on this planet. Mind you, they use capitalism as a scapegoat for everything, but when you look at it, it's all fascism. The economy's not doing well because this, because of free market capitalism. Oh, so we need more regulations on that. That's the problem. It's all these regulations that have basically, and too big to fails, that have basically is what's killing everything. It is these too big to fails. You have to let this stuff fail. It's failing anyway. That's the whole point. And this is why a war has to begin soon for the United States, because the Russians, again, they're not stupid enough to strike first, but they will back the United States into a corner to the point where it can't do anything. And well, think about it. If you're the Russians, okay, now I'm not giving the Russian government is no better than the U.S. government. It's just a different New World Order, right? People talk about, oh, the New World Order's coming. It's already here. We've been in a New World Order for, probably 1,000 years. Who knows? It's basically corrupt elites, power-hungry people. Now, the Russians, they don't want to go to war. And the reason why I know that is because if they didn't roll tanks directly into the Ukraine and into Poland with Russian Federation flags on them over the overthrow of Yakovich, they're not going to bite. The Chinese, same thing. They don't want a shooting war. They know what's coming. They're preparing for it. Same with the Russians. They're preparing for it, but they don't want a shooting war. And a lot of the countries in the Middle East are like, well, okay, we know that the U.S. and NATO airstrikes are completely useless against because they're not really taking out anything of any value. And there's U.S. pilots that are out there questioning, again, why is my airplane ready to go? Got my F-18 ready to go, and by the time they tell you to hold pattern until you run out of fuel, and then by the time they refuel you, you get up in the air, and then you get over your target, and the target's either gone or it's of no value to hit. So, but yet they're hitting a lot of Assad's infrastructure, food supplies, fuel, that type of thing. And even Assad points that out. Like they have an alliance with Iran, but their alliance is basically can include military stuff, but it's not an absolute alliance. They don't have to intervene if they don't want to, but they want to work well together. And the Russians, again, are starting to bring stuff in, so we know that they're going to kill the jihadis where they find them. Now, the only country in the world right now that's out there saying this is a bad idea is the United States. Everybody else is saying, well, if the Russians are willing to go in there, put boots on the ground, kill the ISIS guys, and they're willing to take the cost of that, and it's not just a financial cost; it's a human cost. They're going to lose people there. They're going to lose tanks, sure. They're going to lose aircraft. They're going to get people killed there, their own people, and they're willing to do this. They're willing to, fight alongside Assad's troops to back them so that they can get the upper hand. And again, there's nobody, no leader in the world that can really explain why they wouldn't back the Syrian army to overthrow ISIS. There's no reason. I say, okay, well, let them deal with it, and we'll stay neutral. Fine, I can understand that, like Switzerland does. And notice they never usually have any trouble. But the thing is that for the people out there saying, well, Assad's a dictator and he uses chemical weapons against his own people and barrel bombs and stuff, it's the most lame excuses. The United Nations has come out and said, look, there's no evidence of Assad using chemical weapons against his own people. These barrel bomb things are just a joke. Like, okay, yeah, if they're dropping barrel bombs, it's because they're out of, high-powered bombs like the 500-pounders, the 1,000-pounders, the stuff that takes out a city block, and they're worried about a barrel bomb drop. It's just the dumbest things ever. So the thing is and somebody brought up a good point there about the ISIS guys now training on American-made M16s. Well, this is where Israel ties in, and it's like a duh moment. But basically, the Israelis use the M16 as well as the Tabor rifle, which you can buy one of those here, non-restricted in Canada. Which is pretty cool. It's a bullpup. It shoots a 2.23 round or a 5.56, right? So again, why would a jihadi who's been using an AK forever and a day suddenly pick up an M16? Because again, where is he going to get the ammo, right? Well, that probably explains it. That's probably where he's going to be getting the ammo, probably from Israel. That would make the most sense. And we do know the Israelis using the Mossad has trained up ISIS fighters or Free Syrian Army, whichever you want to refer to them as, same jihadi groups, ISIS and the Free Syrian Army, yes, there is a little bit of tribal difference between them, but they are working together. They're so intertwined you can't tell them apart. A jihadi group is a jihadi group, basically, and same with al-Nusra and stuff like that. And yes, the Jordanians have, with the U.S., trained up about 4,000 of them, and same with the Saudis and all that. Now, the thing is Egypt seems to be a bit of a wild card because they're now going to be conducting, and I already referred to it there, that they're going to be conducting a big paratrooper drill in the next couple of weeks with the Russians. It's the largest that they've done together. Now, they've recently also done a Navy exercise together about a month or two ago, where you had Russian officials standing on basically U.S.-made Aegis warships. And the thing about that is that all this stuff that we've given the Egyptians and the Saudis and all that, the Russians are going to be able to see how it works. And because of that, it puts U.S. pilots, they're going to know how to shoot down a U.S. airplane, no problem. Why? Because they've got the F-16s to look at from the Egyptians, and then of course there's a base in Iraq that they're going to be starting there. They're again doing 2 flights a day with those big Antov aircraft, big like the 225 or whatever, the big huge aircraft, and they're dropping off tons of supplies. So they're getting ready for a major offensive, or to back a major offensive, which will either push ISIS right into Israel, which is going to be a problem for Israel, or right into Saudi Arabia. Now, the Turks, they're kind of, again, it's hard to say which way they're going to go, but they do seem to be more loyal to Russia than they do the United States in a lot of ways. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But at this stage of the game, again, we got tanks in there, we got attack helicopters in there, we've got fighter jets, interceptors, bombers, troops, huge submarines, nuclear submarines off the coast. It's pretty much, if you can't see what the Russians are up to right now. And the thing is they're not hiding it. They're telling everybody. They're using the U.S. lie of, going in to fight ISIS, where, people are starting to figure out that, the United States is not basically taking out U.S.-made Humvees. They're not taking out those 70 Abrams tanks. It's not like they can't find these things. I mean, these things aren't hard for them to find. They have LoJacks on them, most likely. They would know where these things are. And not only that, with the U.S. satellites out there, you're telling me, with the amount of surveillance over Iraq, they can't find these things? With the drones flying around all over, they can't find these things? I don't think so. Again, they're not taking them out. So I think we're going to see some probably pretty soon. And I think the Russians will televise this. They'll probably say, "Hey, look, here's our Black Shark helicopter taking out an Abrams tank." They're gonna show you all this U.S. made equipment, right? And people are gonna again question, well, why do they have this? How did they get a hold of it? Well, they left it behind. It was by accident. Well, not necessarily by accident, because the Iraqi military basically had a lot of this stuff, and they just basically handed it over to ISIS. In other words, ISIS has been the luckiest jihadi group on the planet. They keep getting armed by the guys who are supposed to fight them, and then we always arm the people who fight in the future. So, with that said, people are, I think the European countries are starting to say, okay, no, well, the thing on Syria is, if they don't take out ISIS, they're not going to go along with the U.S. sanctions with Russia and stuff like that. So we could also look at it this way. I mean, the Russians are going to benefit big time if the Eurozone breaks up, because they're going to be able to do more trade. And that could be a possibility of, the Russians putting the pressure on to get the refugees keep fleeing and stuff like that. But if they can take back Syria, okay, and all these refugees start coming back home, guess what happens? Well, everybody's going to like the Russians now, aren't they? The Syrians are going to like the Russians. The Europeans are going to like the Russians. Why? Because the Europeans don't want these refugees. They can't. They're getting their retirements cut, especially like places like Greece and Spain and stuff like that. They're getting their retirements cut. There's not enough medications. They have a limited amount of money they can take out of the bank at a time. And then of course you've got Germany that's bailing all these other countries out like Greece and Spain and stuff like that. And they're broke. They can't do it. So if somebody's going to take away ISIS and allow these people to go back home, which I'm sure these people would be more than happy to go back home, well, it's everybody's going to look at the Russians as the heroes, right? So because it's going to be pretty obvious, whenever, if the Russians, within a couple of weeks, start pushing back the ISIS lines left, right, and center, people are going to say, how come they could do it so quickly and, the NATO guys couldn't? They're using air power too, right? So we'll have to wait and see how this plays out and stuff like that. And I'm going to wrap this one up because I still got a bit of a sore throat. That's why I'm all gaspy and kind of slurring my words and everything and that. But anyway, yeah. So we'll have to definitely keep an eye on how the Europeans are going to react. And I think it's like I said with Ukraine, even though that's kind of sitting where it's sitting. Right from the get-go, I said at some point they're going to throw the Ukraine under the bus, and I think if they're going to do it over Syria, they're going to do it over the Ukraine too. In other words, Ukraine, they're going to get wiped out by Russia is what's going to happen, and they're going to allow it to happen. The people are going to say, well, we don't want to support the neo-Nazis, U.S.-backed neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. Yes, I get it. It's not all of them. It's, but the Azov battalion is a Nazi battalion. I'm sure not every guy in it is a Nazi. I get that, but there's a huge Nazi faction there that you just can't deny it, right? And we know where Samantha Powers and Victoria Nuland and all those people talking about overthrowing Yanukovych government and stuff like that. We know it was a U.S.-backed coup, and we know George Soros money was there, and everybody knows all this stuff, and it's pretty much hard to deny it. So. Even with that, it's like you have Ukrainian generals out there talking about how it was basically a Zionist banker takeover, by the U.S. And if it's by the U.S., it's really on behalf of Israel or the Rothschild, all that stuff. So it's always the same players, right? So if it sounds like I'm demonizing Israel, I'm demonizing their government because their government has done a lot of bad things. But that said, what I'm saying is we don't need to be in the Middle East at all. But if the Russians want to go and fight ISIS, they can. We should be preparing for them on our borders, not the other way around. And the best way to do that is strict immigration. Find out who's coming into your country, find out who's leaving, find out where they're going. And if they go there, that's where they spend the rest of their lives. Because if they ever come back, you put them in jail for 150 years. No possibility of parole, no possibility of visits or anything like that, because they're just too dangerous. Now, most people are not going to live 150 years, so you get what I'm saying. You lock them up for the rest of their natural lives. So only after their day in court, so you don't need all this police state stuff. It's just if you can prove that they're a terrorist, well, there you go, you can get them. But I think most people are, kind of questioning why we're going to go along with the U.S. stuff if it's, if they're funding these terrorists. Again, it doesn't make sense to have our guys killed by the people we're arming. It just makes no sense. So the Russians, again, they're not really the good guys here, but they're definitely the worst thing about the Russians right now is the way they're winning is by doing two things. They're doing the right thing, and all they have to do is tell the truth to make the U.S. look bad. All they have to do is expose the U.S. foreign policy, and that even people in the states are, responding to that, saying, "Oh, Putin's a better leader than Obama" and stuff like that. And they're saying this not because he's a better leader; it's just because people know how corrupt their leader is. But trust me, Putin is not a good guy. He's an evil man too. If you think Obama's bad, trust me, Putin is much worse than Obama in a lot of ways. However, Obama and Putin are both puppets, so there's no good guys, right? But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. So if you like this kind of content, please consider making a donation to the channel. Link down below. Thank you very much to everybody who has. Rate, subscribe, share, comment, like. Be true to yourself, be true to others. Always do the right thing, and have yourselves a great day. G'day, hi, and welcome. Alright, let's get into this WW3 update. So, I was listening to Assad talk about, I didn't get to see the whole 40-minute interview, but he was talking a few things about, the U.S. Not cooperating with them and stuff like that. And said there's no dialogue between the West and him. And he also came out and said, he's not going to be pressured by the West to step down. He says, if the people want me to go, I'll go. But I'm not going to go because the West wants me to go. That type of thing. But he says they're blaming, Assad for ISIS and stuff like that. He says, which is ridiculous. He says, he basically, confirms that, yes, ISIS is made up of all these jihadi groups that the U.S. has basically funded. Not just the U.S., it's, there's quite a few people in on this, such as Israelis and etc., etc. And the thing is that what he is saying is that, okay, well, the Russians, they invited the Russians in. Assad's always been more than welcoming to the Russians, to come in and help fight ISIS. But he says the only way we're going to beat ISIS is if we work together. So that question keeps coming up that people won't talk about on mainstream media is it more important that Obama, basically doesn't, comply, to help Assad to overthrow ISIS than it is to have the refugees. So in other words, they care more about overthrowing Assad than they do, defeating ISIS. And it's pretty, it's pretty obvious at this point. But what nobody's asking is why. Well, again, it comes back to the Israeli lobby, the neocon, faction in the States, and it's not just in the States. Pretty much every government in the Western world is, pretty much controlled by Zionists. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, you're just anti-Semite, whatever." Yeah, but you got to look at it for what it is. Look at the policy. The policy tells you a lot. You have a lot of Zionists out there in Europe and in Canada and the United States talking about everybody opening their borders for the refugees, but yet nobody's talking about Israel opening its borders for the refugees. You know what I mean? It's kind of funny how they do that, right? A little bit of a double standard there. But there's also another take on it here that you have to keep in mind, is that other countries are starting to, back out of the United States is isolating itself big time through U.S. foreign policy. And I agree with Paul Craig Roberts on this one, that U.S. foreign policy is to generate as much hatred for the United States, and I can imagine Israel as well, as possible, so that they always have an enemy to fight, right? So that, war's a racket and everything like that. But there's multi agendas here too, so we have to look at that as well. But one of the things about U.S. foreign policy is that people are looking at it and saying, okay, we have Assad. Is he a nice guy? No, we know he's not a nice guy. But we also know ISIS is a hell of a lot worse. So we're seeing the Russians go in, and they're, they're getting ready to, they're putting tanks in there, not a lot of stuff, but they are putting stuff in there to fight the Islamic State, and there's already rumors out there that they already are. Now, the Russians have been in there since the beginning. I remember seeing video footage of a T-90, two T-90s going through Syria with Russians in them. And we also know about the, 84,000 Ukrainian and Russian mercenaries that were going to go and help Assad. Remember, there was already a lot of Russians in Syria anyway, because, around the base of Tartus and stuff like that. So basically, right now, what the United States is telling everybody is that anybody in Libya that's a U.S. citizen, it's best to leave now. So they're saying that for a reason, right? So they're telling people to get the hell out of Dodge just because some massive conflict is coming down the pike. Now, there's another problem. It looks like a few countries are not, they're kind of questioning the U.S. foreign policy, and they're saying, "Hey, we don't know if we want to go along with this anymore." And we'll have to see where it leads to and how it plays out. But it looks like a really big player in there. Well, we'll start with Australia. Australia apparently just had some regime change there. Apparently, they go through a lot of prime ministers. I'm not always 100% up on the Australian politics. I get an idea of, I mean, their system is fairly similar to here in Canada, but a little bit different processes there as well. And they just got a new guy, and the new guy apparently not much better than the old guy, but at least he's more willing to deal with the Russians. Now, it also comes at a time when France and Germany, and I think a few other countries, are starting to question the sanctions against Russia because they're looking at the United States, who's still doing business with Russia, meanwhile telling everybody else, do sanctions against Russia. It's the most bizarre thing, right? And we're also looking at the migrant crisis, which is very, very prominent now. Now, somebody has come out and said that the whole thing about this crisis, why it popped up so fast, I mean, it's been going on for a long time.